From the Mossad Files, this is a video extra. I'm Dan Raviv, former CBS correspondent, author or co-author of 6 books about Israeli intelligence and security, and very happy to be joined now by Jason Burke, who is the international security correspondent for the British-based newspaper The Guardian and author of a book that I think is going to get widely noticed. It already is, I know, in your country, Great Britain, now published in the United States. It's called The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s. Jason Burke, welcome to the Mossad Files.
Great to be here, Dan. Thanks for the invitation.
You know, I have read most of the book. It is well over 600 pages, so it takes a while or keeps you company for a good long while. And I would say there sure is a lot of hijacking. There's a lot of violence, and there's ideology and explanation as to why the 1970s had so much of that. From early in the book, where we meet Layla Khaled, a Palestinian, and the subject is largely hijacking aircraft aimed at Israel and its allies as much as possible, and all the way to encountering Osama bin Laden, not quite in the 1970s, but as your book spills into 1984. And right, we have the foreshadowing of bigger and worse things to come. Why did you decide to be quite so sweeping and detailed? Because whether it's a hijacking, the shooting by Japanese terrorists in the arrival hall at Lod Airport in Israel, the Munich Olympics massacre in 1972, you've got almost a moment by moment, and that makes your book long, to be very frank, but highly detailed. Why did you decide to be so detailed?
I think you can't understand any violent act, particularly not terrorism, without understanding the context and the circumstances as well as the people involved. And what I wanted to do with my book was create that world, take the reader into the 1970s. Actually, the book goes from about 1967 through to 1984-5, as you point out, Dan. But really make it immersive, make it dynamic and full of action and people and so forth, but really put the reader there on the ground so that they can draw their own conclusions and understand why things happened. And for that, you need a lot of detail. You need those little moments and those words or quotes and those references that really bring somewhere to life and make it authentic and authoritative. So I mean, that was part of the reason. The other reason was it was just so much great stuff. I didn't want to leave it out.
No, now you're sounding a little bit like a mountain climber, right? You went up the Himalayas, Mount Everest, because it's there. Not exactly that, but you were able to reach diaries, interviews. You interviewed the famous, or if you will, notorious plane hijacker Layla Khaled several times, according to your notes. So you had, I guess we journalists say, so much stuff. And you have written it very elegantly. As I say, this book will keep you company for a long time. And if you're old enough to remember the news headlines in the 1970s, you are reminding us, you are connecting the dots between these various incidents and organizations. So you've become, of course, a historian, right? Just to understand the 70s is striking enough. But if you're anything like me, also being a journalist, again and again, when we know what's going on these days, we see we've got unresolved situations. And a lot of it, frankly, is the existence of Israel and the desire by revolutionists, the author of your book, to oppose Israel, maybe wipe out Israel. Would you agree? Israel is at the center of many of these battles.
I mean, Israel's certainly at the center of the book. The Palestinian issues certainly core to the book, but it's not just about that because, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is how in the late 60s, Israel became very much part of a much broader, progressive, radical cause alongside Vietnam and alongside apartheid South Africa and much else. And that wasn't the case previously. This is what I was discovering as I did my historical research, that it was from 67 that really came about, and I wanted to look at revolutionary activism in that period. I was particularly interested in international terrorism, so that's what I focused on.
Have you
Uh,
concluded that the people you're writing about, including, say, Japanese Red Army activists, who then would make connections and encounter and work with German radicals and Palestinians and others, in any sense, were they looking for a cause? And in 1967, Israel had just captured the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and the Sinai. So a real focus on the Palestinian territories. Were they looking for a cause? And so what Israel had done, capturing the territories, starting to build settlements, was the cause they found?
I think they had loads of causes, and what happened with Israel was that moment allowed Israel to be seen not as it had been previously, which was as a outpost of socialist democracy, effectively, in the Middle East, surrounded by autocratic Arab dictatorships, which was the view of many progressives in the US and Western Europe until that point. But it suddenly became seen as um, a, an extension of US imperialism, of capitalism, of all the things that this radical progressive moment of the 1960s or movement in the late 1960s was protesting about. So
That is
Israel just
possibly, wait, that is possibly a positive answer to my question, right? The radicals were looking for a cause that was easy to grab onto. It had a physical manifestation. Israel had occupied territory. They were looking for a cause.
well, they had causes already. I mean, they had Vietnam was the big one. South Africa was another one, and I mean, there's some evidence that pro-Palestinian activists really went out and pushed the cause as much as they could do, but on the other, in kind of campuses and so forth in the West, but they didn't really need to. And one of the things I look at in the book, and it was really interesting digging into this and talking to people who were there and were actually doing it, was the flow of volunteers immediately from Europe, from the US, from Latin America, even from India, elsewhere, to Palestinian training camps in first Jordan and then latterly Lebanon in that period, where they all went, and one rather jaded journalist said they went and came back with a keffiyeh and a suntan and a book of poetry. But some of them went a bit further and they got involved in weapons training and other things too. So that movement of many hundreds, possibly several thousand young people from the West, and as I say elsewhere, into these camps indicates that there was a significant groundswell of support, and it began, and the Palestinian cause or the fight against Israel, anti-Zionism, became a very central part of a lot of the campaigning on the hard left and associated kind of political movements at that time.
Hmm. As I said, Jason, as I read your book, as I read The Revolutionists again and again, I felt about conflicts that haven't been resolved, or if you will, causes and issues that are still talked about on
Absolutely.
campuses. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's one of the things that struck me as I was writing it was, the language that is being used, say settler colonialism, which is what Israel is accused of very often these days. That was actually coined by a French Marxist academic in 1967. So this kind of language that emerged in that period is very much with us today, and the idea that Israel is part of a broader complex of capitalism and supposed imperialism. And as we said, there's a good dose of anti-Semitism in some of that criticism at the time, as there is now.
Okay, let's talk about the counterterrorism because I think it's clear in your book, even from the beginning, when the hijacking of an El Al Israeli airliner is foiled because of the presence of an armed air marshal aboard the plane. And then later, well, of course, there's the failure of security in your very detailed account of the Munich Olympics events of 1972, which ended in a massacre, and you're very detailed about that, and even raised the question as to whether the Palestinian attackers at the Munich Olympics had wanted to kill all the athletes. You raised the question that maybe they didn't. They really wanted to establish their cause and get away. But how about the Mossad afterward? And again, you're very subtle. You're not suggesting that the assassinations by Israeli gunmen in Europe and then in Beirut after the 1972 Olympics were direct revenge. I think you quite rightly show that it's part of the shadow war. Here was the war now being fought in third countries and in Europe. So what do you think of the Mossad, if I can put it that way? Because in your book, they seem effective, but of course not perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to be realistic. I tried to approach the Mossad without the kind of myths, and also, a lot of the literature, not your own, Dan, but a lot of the literature about the Mossad is very kind of celebratory and it's very kind of gung ho. It's coming from one perspective. Now, I spoke to Mossad veterans, people who've been active at the time in the 70s. I also spoke to the people they were trying to kill, and actually it was both ways, and there were casualties on the Mossad side during the kind of shadow war as well. Um, and I wanted to unpick some of those myths, and one of the myths is that post Munich you had this kind of implacable campaign of assassination that was highly efficient and disciplined and very well resourced and took down all the main culprits for who were responsible for the massacre at the
At the
Olympics.
Olympic Games, yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that simply wasn't the case. It was a pretty ad hoc effort. It wasn't very well resourced. They made mistakes, and really they weren't trying to simply take down those responsible, the perpetrators for the attack on the Israeli delegation at the Olympic Games in 72, but they were trying to disrupt and deter and eliminate all sorts of enemies. Um, and the were partially successful, as these things often are. But as importantly, they sent a very strong message. And that message was one that was also a very big part of what was happening with the operation. And one thing that was really interesting was looking at the reaction of, say, the CIA and MI6 and other kind of Western three-letter agencies to that campaign. And the CIA described it as counter-terror, but without, not counter-terrorism, but counter-terror, as if there was some kind of effort by the Israelis to equally terrorize their enemies. It was a really interesting. I found that in one of a CIA analytic report from the period. The British were much more explicit and just called it Israeli terrorist activities, filed it in as such. So there was all this kind of, I've got my own views and you will have yours and viewers will have theirs, but this is what the kind of official view was at the time. And so it was much more about, I was interested in the ambivalence of it. I was interested in, it was a genuine shadow war. I mean, one of the things we know now is that a lot of the Israeli intelligence that was so important to that campaign was coming from Western European counterparts that was being circulated on this secret network that we call Kilowatt that we've now discovered. Recent research has turned up. And I've seen those files, and it's really clear that there'll be an assassination in Paris, and the French police will be sending requests to the Israelis saying, "Do you know who's responsible for this?" Or and obviously it was the Israelis. They know that, and there's this incredible sort of game being played. And then even after it was clear that these assassinations were going on, all the various actually it wasn't CIA who were on this route. I've got to correct myself. It was the FBI that were involved in this particular network, but nonetheless, all these agencies were very happy to supply information to the Israelis in full knowledge that they were committing such extrajudicial assassinations in Europe. So I think it was a very interesting area.
Yeah, no, well, for sure. But Jason, that makes me wonder to what degree the Western authorities, for lack of another term, were overwhelmed. Because again, your book, The Revolutionists, shows that this is international in scope. It's backed by strong ideology. There's this saying that about terrorism, right? That the bad guys, as someone in the FBI might put it, right? The bad guys only have to be right once. They'll get through one flaw in security, whereas counterterrorism has to be right all the time. So
That's
were the good guys overwhelmed?
um, th- at the beginning they had great difficulty understanding what they were up against, and to the Israelis' credit, they grasped it faster than anyone else and started to put uh, solutions in place. And one of the biggest things that the Israelis pioneered during that period was the development of specialist military or police units that could assault a plane, an embassy, whatever, and forcibly end a terrorist episode, a crisis of that nature. Now, in 70, and for the Germans in 72, for example, at the Olympics, they just simply did not have that capability. And as I was saying earlier, in 1970, when there was a multiple hijacking you were talking about just then, the Israelis came out of it much better because the one plane that wasn't taken was the one with the Israeli air marshal on board. Um,
Yeah.
and the others were all taken very easily. So the Israelis were ahead of the game on this, but for the others, they didn't even have a vocabulary. I mean, they were talking about skyjackers, air pirates. Nobody knew what to call them, and it was as if this whole new world had opened up of aviation, and the terrorist groups, the armed factions that were using terrorist tactics, were much quicker to exploit that strategic territory, if you like, than the governments were to protect it. It took 5, 6, 7, or 8 years before, 1970, the Israelis do it in 1972, Lod, with one hijacking, and they assault a plane successfully. Free the passengers. They do it again in 76 in Entebbe. The Germans do it in 77. British assault a embassy in 81 and do it
The
then.
rescue at the
So
Iran embassy again.
exactly.
All of these in your book, highly detailed, which gives us more of a sense of how the counterterrorism forces, if you will, were getting better and better. Yes.
But interestingly, in that early period, everybody's very interested in the root causes. So even right-wing politicians are discussing, what's causing this, what makes people go to the dark side, why do people radicalize? The Germans, who have a really big problem with radical leftist violence, are launching massive kind of sociological research projects. They're very serious about trying to establish what the cause is. By the time you get to the 80s, when actually the capability to counter this is much greater, and precautions and airports have cut these hijackings right down, that kind of thing, then you get a situation where politicians, particularly right wing conservative politicians, are either blaming it all on the USSR, which is not the case. Even the CIA said that wasn't the case, um, and or simply saying there's no point in looking for root causes. You just got to kill the bad guys. And the problem with
Tell
that
me
is
about
they
the
do
role.
kill the bad guys.
Tell me about the
They,
role of women in your book,
ah,
The
yeah, yeah, sure.
Revolutionists. The female members of the various organizations, whether the Baader Meinhof gang, so to speak, Red Army
Yeah,
faction in Germany,
yeah.
and Japanese and others. That was I think, a breakthrough in the world of, you can call it crime or activism, but it was
Sure.
quite a change. Women, yeah.
So the women in particularly, well, obviously with the leftists, played a very important role. The German Red Army faction, that also the German groups, revolutionary cells, and various other ones were very, very heavily recruiting among women. They had about 50% of their membership women. Some of their founder members were women, and women's rights was a very key part of their platform, and they were also highly effective. I mean, really effective people. Some of the most impressive, actually. I mean, like you talk about the Baader Meinhof gang. Actually, Andreas Baader, who got all the attention, was an idiot. I mean, he was a really unpleasant human being, megalomaniac, quite useless at organizing anything much. The people who organized it were Ulrike Meinhof, a female journalist, radical journalist, was one of the founders, and she did a lot of the ideology and thinking and the propaganda. Gudrun Enslin, who was a fiercely intelligent English literature PhD, girlfriend of Baader, She was really the kind of logistics driving force and the decision maker, and a very effective operator. You might not agree with what she did or said, but I mean, she was very competent. I mean, tragically competent in many ways. Um,
It may be a minor point, but when you write about Layla Khaled, again, the notorious or famous hijacker, skyjacker, Palestinian, whom you met, whom you interviewed, uh, at least once in your book, you say people were surprised in law enforcement that she was so nice.
Yeah, well, that was when she was arrested and she was detained in London, and they took her to a police station, and the police officers were expecting this sort of, I don't know, someone who's like 7 foot high and carrying thousands of grenades or something. And in fact, she's a very small, very slight 26-year-old Palestinian girl, very well spoken, speaks very good English, highly articulate. She's still articulate now, and when I was interviewing her. Um, and they, that she just did not match their image of what an Arab terrorist should be. And so they were surprised and made their surprise known to inquisitive journalists who were asking them about the very famous prisoner that they had in the police station in West
Yeah.
London.
That she was small and nice. Jason, let me end this interview about the revolutionists with this question. Maybe you're facing it from other interviewers. Frankly, if you were of a leftist, what I'll call radical point of view, what the revolutionists were trying to accomplish in the 1970s, was it worth it? Did they find at least their sense of
Yeah.
significance? Did they feel they were fighting against the machine effectively?
They did. That's what they wanted. A lot of some of them didn't. Carlos the Jackal, I talk about a lot, and he was just out for himself. I mean, he had no interest in ideology really at all. But others were genuinely committed to a kind of radical transformation of everything, of the world, of their communities, of their nations, everything. For the good, social justice, all these kind of great things. But what they did, if you look at the detail, that's one we started talking about the detail. That's one of the reasons I wanted to get the detail in there. At the end of the day, it was sordid, it was squalid, it was violent, and it was counterproductive. It did no good whatsoever. And there were other ways to fight for that. And the people who did eventually start fighting for it by democratic means, through protests, through lobbying, through activism in different ways, got much further and won
Oh,
much more.
even on the Palestinian issue, because
The
it could
Palestinian,
be argued that an event like the Munich Olympics attack in 72 truly put the PLO's demands on the world stage, and Yasser Arafat became legitimized years after that, a few years.
Arafat became legitimized when he appeared before the UN and spoke, which was 74. Even before then, he'd dumped the violence because he'd recognized it was counterproductive. The PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, had pioneered that violence. George Bush had the same reaction, and he jettisoned the kind of long range attacks which involved third parties, the US, the UK, France, whatever. It was just breakaway factions that carried on. Some of them sponsored by Gaddafi, some acting for themselves, but other regimes. But really, the inroads made, the progress made by the Palestinians were not made through the notoriety gained by the violence against the innocents around the world. It was that merely tarnished the name of Palestinians with the label of terrorists for decades, really, and was pretty damaging. So, I mean, I think there is an argument that they gained notoriety. They put their cause before people and made them pay attention, which is true to an extent, but in a very, very expensive way in terms of their public relations. And I don't think it would be justified as an argument, as a tactic now or even then.
And if I may say, an echo of that would be October 7th of 2023, where the more extremist than the mainstream, Arafat faction, that is Hamas, attacked Israel, murdered many Israelis, over 1,200, of course, took hostages, a shock that I guess Hamas activists figure that some think it's worth it, but you've seen the destruction in the Gaza Strip. Doesn't look worth
Sure,
it to me.
and also, I mean, one of the things we have to say, Dan, is that what we're talking about is, as a very good commentator at the time said in the 70s, early 70s, that terrorists wanted, any of them, whether whoever they were, wanted on the whole a lot of people watching and not a lot of people dead. Um, it was about sending a message. It was not about killing people or blowing things up, particularly in just pure destruction. It was about propaganda, and they recognized that the deaths would be sometimes useful, but on the whole, that was sought to be was what they tried to avoid. Um, Whereas October the 7th, you're in a completely different world of violent extremism and activism. I mean,
And
you're incomparably different.
right, Hamas clearly wanting to kill people as we see. Okay, thanks. There's so much more we could cover, but Jason Burke, international security correspondent for The Guardian, your breakthrough book is this sweeping history that I admire very much. Yes, I said it was long, but that's value for money. That's what I think, Jason. And the book is called The Revolutionists: The Story of the Extremists Who Hijacked the 1970s. Jason Burke, thanks for speaking with me here on the Mossad Files.
Thanks, Dan. It's always a pleasure. I look forward to the next time.
My thanks again to Jason Burke. The title of his new book is The Revolutionists. Just a quick word about my weekly audio podcast, The Mossad Files with Dan Raviv. We talk about Israeli strategy, Middle East events. Every week there's an interesting interview. So look for that audio podcast, The Mossad Files. And also please look for my most recent books, co-authored with Yossi Melman. There's an ebook, very affordable, called Target Iran, telling how the Mossad penetrated Iran and had so many secret agents inside Iran when that war broke out this past June, and our wider history of Israeli intelligence and espionage. It's called Spies Against Armageddon: Inside Israel's Secret Wars. So please look for our books, look for my podcast, and thanks very much.